Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, September 7th, 2022. Senate Democratic and Republican leaders asked for some more details about bills expected on the schedule during what could be the final month of legislative action before there's another break to allow senators up for re-election to campaign. Those bills include guaranteeing the right to same-sex marriage and keeping the federal government funded to prevent a shutdown. Former President Barack Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama visiting the White House for the unveiling of their official portraits. It's a tradition that usually takes place with the immediate president successor, but never happened during the Donald Trump term. Another United Nations Security Council meeting on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this time Russia's alleged use of filtration camps and forced deportations of Ukrainians. And new British Prime Minister Liz Truss getting questions in the House of Commons for the first time during Prime Minister's Question Time, second day on the job. We'll talk about how that went and what's next for the new Prime Minister with C-SPAN's Westminster producer Peter Knowles in London. And we start on Capitol Hill, Senate leaders holding their regular Tuesday news conferences, but the first time since coming back from the August break, and getting questions from reporters about the major bills on the agenda over the next month, including a government funding bill, both the full fiscal year bill if possible, or short-term CR or continuing resolution to keep the government going. Also permitting reform designed to speed up development of fossil fuel and other energy projects, plus a bill dealing with the right to same-sex marriage. Democrats and Republicans holding separate news conferences. The Democrats went first. Here is the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
An update, or will you hold an up and down vote on same-sex marriage, and do you have 60 votes yet?
Okay, so first let's remember why a vote on the respect for marriage is necessary. Millions upon millions of American women had their right taken away by the extremist MAGA Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision. And in a concurring opinion, Justice Thomas opened the door to the Supreme Court going even further. The MAGA Republicans are taking over the Republican Party, and they've made it abundantly clear they're not satisfied with repealing Roe. So when some Republicans say, oh, a vote's unnecessary, it won't happen, they said the same thing about Roe. And here's where we are. So we had a very good conversation today in our caucus about marriage equality. We all want to pass this quickly. Only our two leading members on this issue, Senators Baldwin and Sinema, are working with Republicans to see if there are enough votes to pass the bill. But let me be clear, a vote will happen. A vote on marriage equality will happen on the Senate floor in the coming weeks, and I hope there will be 10 Republicans to support it. Yes?
Is marriage equality going to be looped in with the larger CR that you guys are talking
We
about?
would prefer to do it as a separate bill. We hope there are 10 Republicans to help us with that. Yes, yes.
How long on the CR are you willing to go into the new year? Would you prefer a longer spending bill because you guys, didn't get your spending priorities implemented until March? Does that help you?
Look, we want to get it. We prefer to get an omnibus bill done before the end of the year. We think there are a good number of Republicans who agree with that. And so we're hoping about mid-December, the CR will go till about mid-December, and then we might do an omnibus.
Senator Schumer, have you in fact promised Joe Manchin includes the permitting reform in the CR?
Permitting reform is part of the IRA, and we will get it done. Yes.
Are you concerned that Republicans are opposed to COVID aid, monkeypox aid, and increased Ukraine funding for the CR?
Yeah, look, we're opposed. Let me say a couple of things here. Ukraine needs more help. We want to give it to them. And on monkeypox and on COVID relief, we need to be prepared. We've always been prepared as a country. And it's disgraceful that Republicans are playing political games with this when the health of the nation is at stake. Yes.
Schumer, President Putin was speaking in Vladivostok today, where he said Russia has been able to reach all of its strategic goals and hasn't lost anything. Do you agree with him?
Who believes Putin these days? Yes.
On the election reform bills that the working group released, do you plan to hold a vote on those, and will they be in the lame duck session?
It's something we'd like to get done, and we're going to try to figure out the best way to get it done. Yes.
Mr. Leader, have you requested a Gang of Eight briefing on the Mar-a-Lago documents, and if so, when do you expect to get that?
Look, I have a great deal of faith in Merrick Garland and how he's pursuing it, And in terms of the specifics, our Intelligence Committee is working very closely with them to see, that our secrets, what has happened to our secrets, and to see what should be done about that. Last one.
With regard to permitting reform, the deal that you struck in the press release you sent out, Senator Manchin, it said that you would have that resolved in this fiscal year. Senator Manchin said that is the CR. That can only be the CR.
Our intention is to add it to the CR. Absolutely. Okay.
No
Thank you, everybody.
No worry about a shutdown.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, taking reporters' questions after he and other Senate Democratic leaders held a news conference on Capitol Hill about that same-sex marriage bill. It passed the House in July with 47 Republicans joining all Democrats in voting yes, and the Hill reporting that 3 Senate Republicans are seen as yes votes when it comes up this month. Susan Collins of Maine, Rob Portman of Ohio, and Tom Tillis of North Carolina, and about 9 others are potential. And again, they do need 10 in order to avoid a filibuster, that is, the Democrats do. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell also, in a separate news conference, answering reporters' questions about the agenda, starting with that government funding measure, the CR, or continuing resolution.
Does a clean CR, in your mind, mean no money for Ukraine? And are you concerned about getting Ukraine money in either the CR or the omnibus because it might be harder to pass some of that money next year?
Well, I think the cleaner the CR, the better. Ukraine is obviously a priority for most of us on both sides of the aisle. We'll have to see what they're requesting and how much of it is actually designed to help Ukraine wage the war. These are the discussions that are going on right now with Senator Shelby and his team and Senator Leahy and his team. But overall, the cleaner, the better.
Leader McConnell, would you support Donald Trump helping Republicans more financially in the midterms? And also, what is the Republican plan to make up for the cash crunch of the NRSC?
Well, look, what I think I can safely say is all 50 members of the Senate on my side of the aisle are doing everything they can to find a way to help get to 51. And that's exactly what the other side's doing. And once we finish up our work here this month, we'll all be in full campaign mode.
Leader McConnell, thank you so much. Switching to Iran, White House today said there's still gaps when it comes to signing the nuclear deal between the Islamic Republic. Some members of your party traveled, including Senator Lindsey Graham, to Jerusalem lately and said they're opposed to the nuclear deal. When it comes to Iran nuclear deal, has your position changed? And do you think if the Republicans win the midterm, they would have more leverage to resist the nuclear deal, signing a nuclear deal with Iran?
Well, it appears as if this administration, like the Obama administration, is going to take the view that they can do an executive decision, an executive agreement with the Iranians by themselves. It's not a treaty. We objected to their going forward the last time without a treaty, which clearly applies to this situation. They may try to do that again, which minimizes our ability to impact what has all the earmarks of another bad deal.
As a member of the Gang of Eight, do you want a briefing from the Department of Justice or other intelligence agencies about what documents were seized at Mar-a-Lago, and do you have any concerns about the FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago?
Yeah, I'm not, having just gotten back, I've not personally talked to any of the other Gang of Eight about this. I think Senator Rubio's addressed that issue, so maybe you ought to ask him.
Do you think it's appropriate the way that the former president was storing those top secret and classified documents at his private estate at Mar-a-Lago?
Yeah, I don't really have any comments on this whole investigation that's been dominating the news for the last month. I think we're following it like all of you are.
Those are classified documents, Mr. Leader. I mean, that's important. You don't have any comment on that?
Reporter at the end, Chad Pergram from Fox News. Questions to the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, today on Capitol Hill about the FBI search of former President Donald Trump's home. Former Attorney General under former President Trump, William Barr, telling Fox News Channel today that he thinks the Justice Department is getting very close to having the evidence to indict former President Trump. But Bill Barr says he hopes the department will not do that because, he says, what will that do to the country? What kind of precedent will that set? Will the people really understand that this is not, failing to return a library book, that this was serious? That quote from Bill Barr. A story from the Associated Press: the names of hundreds of U.S. law enforcement officers, elected officials, and military members appear on the leaked membership rolls of a far-right extremist group that's accused of playing a key role in the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, according to a report released Wednesday by the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism and that extremist group, the Oath Keepers. This is Washington Today. An increasing number of political attacks on military members is hurting both troops' morale and force readiness, writes the Military Times, quoting the Senate's top defense Democrat, Jack Reed, warning in a speech today at the annual Defense News Conference. Senator Reed said he believes the problem is a reflection of growing political polarization across America today, but added that he is concerned with the military being drawn into those vicious fights. Again, that was from Military Times. Here is Senator Reed.
In this time of division within our politics and society, I am concerned by the increasing frequency of politically motivated attacks on our military. There is a long tradition within the American military of being apolitical, which is essential for our democracy and civilian control of the military. Yet some have chosen to publicly disparage our military leaders for political purposes by generating a sense of outrage and indignation. While such attacks may serve a short-term political agenda, in the long run, it damages the national interest by eroding trust within the ranks, sowing doubt within our civil society, and benefiting our adversaries. These political excesses have grave implications, and they must end.
Democratic Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island, chair of the Armed Services Committee, keynote speech at a conference hosted by Defense News held in Arlington, Virginia. C-SPAN covered it. It'll be available at our website, cspan.org. A story from CNN: former President Barack Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama's official White House portraits were unveiled during an emotional ceremony at the White House on Wednesday, marking their first joint return since they left in 2017, and the return of a Washington tradition last celebrated 10 years ago. Article from CNN goes on: the pieces which will hang inside the White House for decades to come are the first official portraits added to the White House collection since then President Obama held a bipartisan unveiling ceremony for George W. Bush and Laura Bush in 2012. President Obama's image was painted by Robert McCurdy, and Michelle Obama's portrait was painted by Sharon Sprung. Well, before the reveal, some welcome remarks and some praise of the former president by the current president, Joe Biden, who was vice president during the Obama presidency.
President Kennedy once observed that every president must endure the gap between what he would like and what is possible. He was right. The history books are full of stories about presidents trying to bridge that gap. Stories that include the burdens of the office, the difficult decisions, how the work is always serious and often solemn. And all of that's true, but so is this. With Barack as our president, we got up every day and went to work full of hope, for real, full of purpose, and excited about the possibility before us. There are few people I've ever known with more integrity, decency, and moral courage than Barack Obama. Mr. President, nothing could have prepared me better or more to become President of the United States than be at your side for 8 years. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. You know, no matter what the issue was, no matter how difficult, no matter what it was about, doing it, you never did it with just the easy way, what the easy way out was. It was never about doing it that way. It was always about doing what was right, literally. You know, just go down the list of historic presidencies. He never gave up on the simple truth that health care was a right for all Americans. When so many were telling him, including me at one point, take the compromise, take a compromise. We weren't sure we could get anything done on ACA. Think about the compromise. You refused. You went big. And now the Affordable Care Act is there permanently, and it's even being improved on.
President Joe Biden at the White House. He also went on to praise the former First Lady Michelle Obama. And after he finished, both Barack and Michelle Obama came on stage to remove the covers from the official portraits. CNN article on this ceremony writes that Robert McCurdy's depiction of the former president is minimalist, eschewing the conventional props typically associated with a presidential portrait, like a desk or a bookcase, for an entirely blank background, and that Sharon Sprung's interpretation shows the former First Lady appearing to take a brief moment to get comfortable inside one of the most formal rooms in the White House. Unlike her predecessor's portraits, Michelle Obama is wearing a strapless gown in her portrait, perhaps a marker of the country's evolving style. Both of the Obamas spoke then about the importance of making the most of their brief time in the White House to do the most good. First to speak, former President Barack Obama.
His work is so precise that at first glance it looks like a photograph. And Robert also paints his subjects looking straight ahead. So it feels like you're face to face, forming a connection. And that appealed to me, in part because presidents so often get airbrushed, even take on a mythical status, especially after you've gone, and people forget all the stuff they didn't like about you. But what you realize when you're sitting behind that desk, and what I want people to remember about Michelle and me, is that presidents and first ladies are human beings like everyone else. We have our gifts, we have our flaws. You've all experienced mine. We have good days and bad days. We feel the same joy and sadness, frustration and hope. And while it takes a certain amount of self-confidence to be president, there are nights where we lie awake wondering if this or that decision was the right one. I've always described the presidency as a relay race. You take the baton from someone, you run your leg as hard and as well as you can, and then you hand it off to someone else, knowing that your work will be incomplete. The portraits hanging in the White House chronicle the runners in that race. Each of us tasked with trying to bring the country we love closer to its highest aspirations. And when future generations walk these halls and look up at these portraits, I hope they get a better, honest sense of who Michelle and I were. And I hope they leave with a deeper understanding that if we could make it here, maybe they can too. They can do remarkable things too.
Former President Barack Obama at the White House today, the portrait unveiling. Also speaking, the former First Lady Michelle Obama, her portrait also unveiled, and she also spoke about similar themes.
Believe it or not, it is still a bit odd for me to stand in this historic space, see this big, beautiful painting staring back at me. Growing up on Euclid Avenue, Mommy, I never could have imagined that any of this would be part of my story. But even if it's all still a bit awkward for me, I do recognize why moments like these are important, why all of this is absolutely necessary. Traditions like this matter, not just for those of us who hold these positions, but for everyone participating in and watching our democracy. You see, the people, they make their voices heard with their vote. We hold an inauguration to ensure a peaceful transition of power. Those of us lucky enough to serve, work, as Barack said, as hard as we can for as long as we can, as long as the people choose to keep us here. And once our time is up, we move on. And all that remains in this hallowed place are our good efforts and these portraits, portraits that connect our history to the present day, portraits that hang here as history continues to be made. So for me, this day is not just about what has happened, it's also about what could happen. Because a girl like me, She was never supposed to be up there next to Jacqueline Kennedy and Dolly Madison. She was never supposed to live in this house, and she definitely wasn't supposed to serve as First Lady.
Love you, Michelle.
Love you back. But I've always wondered, where does that supposed to come from? Who determines it? And too often in this country, people feel like they have to look a certain way or act a certain way to fit in, that they have to make a lot of money or come from a certain group or class or faith in order to matter. But what we're looking at today, a portrait of a biracial kid with an unusual name and the daughter of a water pump operator and a stay-at-home mom. What we are seeing is a reminder that there's a place for everyone in this country.
Former First Lady Michelle Obama at the White House for the first time since she was First Lady. Current First Lady Jill Biden wrapped up the portraits unveiling ceremony, and you can watch the full thing and see the portraits at our website at cspan.org. You're listening to Washington Today. An update on the federal response to the monkeypox outbreak from the White House Monkeypox Response Coordinator Bob Fenton and the Deputy Coordinator Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis. Dr. Daskalakis saying today the initial effort to get the vaccines out to the most vulnerable has been successful. He briefed reporters at the White House.
We are encouraged by the progress that we're making right now. You'll see the chart to my left. We only have data from 35 jurisdictions. That's just over half of all jurisdictions that are directly receiving vaccine. But over 460,000 doses have been administered. Keep in mind, the population at highest risk is approximately 1.6 million people right now. So even with this partial view we have now from the reporting jurisdictions, we're seeing strong progress really getting shots into arms. So now that supply is less of an issue, we need to make sure we focus on maintaining demand by making sure that people know that effective and safe vaccine is available for those that could benefit. Alongside our vaccination efforts, we've scaled up access to testing and treatments, as well as ensuring that LGBTQAI+ individuals know how to reduce their risk. Together, those efforts are leading to positive trends in the data that CDC has collected over the last couple of weeks, especially in our hardest hit areas.
Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis is the Monkeypox Response Deputy Coordinator, briefing reporters in the White House briefing room along with the coordinator, Bob Fenton. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention monkeypox page shows that the total U.S. cases as of late August, 20,700, most of any country, just under half the world's total. And they also have a listing that 0 people have died from monkeypox in the United States. A milestone for the COVID-19 pandemic response in one of the hardest hit states, New York Governor Kathy Hochul announcing that wearing a mask will no longer be required but encouraged in most places around the state, including on mass transit, due to the major declines in infections and hospitalizations over the past several months.
Department of Health will be issuing new guidance regarding masks based on the CDC guidance, and starting today, masks will be optional. You'll be starting to see these signs. This is our subway sign. So places like shelters, correctional facilities, detention centers, and yes, mass transit, you'll see this little character. And I'm told that's a ponytail off to the side. Do you all see the ponytail? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm not the only one. Masks are encouraged but optional. This is what you're going to see on our subways and our mass transit throughout the state of New York. This is buses upstate. This is transportation everywhere. So we're very, very excited about that as well. So big progress, but also the message at the bottom is very important. Let's respect each other's choices. What that means is you choose not to have a mask. That is your personal decision. You'll do your own personal risk assessment of who you're exposed to, your own vulnerabilities, where you work. You make your own determination. But do not judge your fellow passengers on what their choices are. Let's be respectful. So we want to make sure that we handle that in a mature way, as New Yorkers can and should do. but also remind everyone that masking requirements will remain in effect at adult care facilities, as well as other health care facilities regulated by the Department of Health, while there's still the variant at large. And so I know this is a big change. The MTA will be rolling out the signage, but basically we're going from mandatory to optional. So that is what we're talking about.
New York Governor Kathy Hochul, a Democrat today. New York has had a public transit mask mandate since April 2020. Even after a federal judge struck down the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the federal mask mandate for planes, trains, and buses nationwide back in April, and many other transit systems like Washington, D.C.'s Metro dropped their requirement. New York City's subway and other public transit in that state had kept theirs in place. And Hochul also saying today, I want to thank everyone who's been complying on our transit systems for 28 months, a long time. U.S. Senator John Ossoff of Georgia said that he is tested positive for COVID-19 and is isolating, but there's one catch with him. He's on an official trip to India, so that's where he'll be isolating. His office says he has mild symptoms and he'll return to Washington, D.C. next week. On Wall Street, the Dow up 435, NASDAQ up 246, S&P up 71. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona writes, roll call pushed back Wednesday against Republican criticism of the Biden administration's new student loan debt forgiveness program, saying it would curb defaults and boost the economy. The program, announced last month, will cancel $10,000 in student loan debt for the federal borrowers who earn less than $125,000 a year, and $20,000 for recipients of federal Pell Grants, which target low-income students. The move is expected to benefit 43 million loan borrowers, including 20 million whose debt will be completely canceled. That reporting from Roll Call. Secretary Cardona was at a breakfast with reporters today, hosted by the Christian Science Monitor.
The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a nonpartisan group dedicated to fiscal responsibility, did the numbers on the student loan program, and they said essentially it'll be back where it was by 2028, 1.6 trillion, and then adjusted for inflation, it will be even more by 2031, definitely higher than where it is. I'm sure you've heard this commentary before. What do you think of that?
Thank you, John. Look, this decision to provide debt relief is one strategy out of many. I highlighted earlier. The worst thing that could happen is for us to provide debt relief and be in the same position 5 years from now. So if we don't stop the bleeding, we're going to be in the same position we're in. We're eager to fix the broken system. Public service loan forgiveness, income-driven repayment, ensuring a better return on investment with colleges. You know, college costs have ballooned. We have to make sure we're working with higher education institutions to hold them accountable for a good return on investment. We've increased the college scorecard attributes, meaning parents will know more about graduation rates and gainful employment rates of students that go to those schools. So you're absolutely right, John. If we think that the loan forgiveness alone will help fix the root cause of the issue, that's short-sighted. We are working really hard on those processes that got us to where we are, fixing the broken system. Now, specifically with this recent announcement from the president, the president in the Inflation Reduction Act has reduced the deficit by $300 billion, and it's projected that $1.7 billion will be reduced this year alone. So 1.7 trillion. So, there are efforts to reduce the deficit by the president, and we do believe that debt relief, which is what Americans need right now. I talked to a teacher recently who said, this is going to allow me now to use the funds that I was going to use to pay my loans to help my daughter go to college. It's helping everyday Americans. So the focus is not on only the debt relief, but I think more important, but it's not as flashy, I guess, is fixing a broken system through policy like the income-driven repayment.
Education Secretary Miguel Cardona at a breakfast with reporters, part of our regular series hosted by the Christian Science Monitor. Those questions from John Gizzi, chief political columnist and White House correspondent with Newsmax. While Secretary Cardona and others in the Biden administration maintain that the recently passed laws do provide the legal authority for this student loan forgiveness plan. Arizona's Attorney General Mark Brnovich, a Republican, telling CNBC today that court challenges may happen.
I think it's fundamentally unfair to a lot of folks that saved, that did everything they could do to pay for their own college, to have someone like the President of the United States unilaterally just basically transfer billions, tens of billions, maybe even $1 trillion of wealth from one group to essentially an upper middle class group. People's expectations are starting to get set. And so you want to make sure that there's that consistency and certainty. And I think that means that if we can file a lawsuit, we should file it sooner rather than later. But it also means we have to have sound legal theories in order to move forward. We have programs in the state of Arizona where people can actually, if they come work for the state, reduce the amount of student loans they own. So that there are all sorts of different, I think, legal theories as to how you get to standing. But the big question will be, which is the best one? And if there's more than one, so be it. I think there's some difficulties. Obviously, once people have relied on and have gotten money, and like having them return it, I think is going to be next to impossible. So I do think that means that if you're going to file something, you have to do it sooner rather than later.
Attorney General of Arizona Mark Brnovich, part of his interview today on CNBC. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Thursday on C-SPAN Radio. At 10 a.m. Eastern, the Senate Banking Committee hears testimony from the director of the Federal Insurance Office at the Treasury Department on risks to the insurance industry and the U.S. economy, including climate change and the role of private equity in life insurance. Then at 2 p.m. Eastern, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen gives a speech on the economy at the Ford Motor Company's Rouge Electric Vehicle Center in Dearborn, Michigan. Listen on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app or ask your smart speaker to play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. A story in the New York Times today: as his forces struggle in Ukraine and his economy strains under sanctions, President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia struck a defiant tone on Wednesday, arguing that the West had failed in its economic, financial, and technological aggression against Russia, and that his country had only gained from the global furor over his invasion. Mr. Putin said at an economic conference in the far eastern Russian city of Vladivostok, "We have not lost anything, and we will not lose anything." That from the New York Times. In New York City, the United Nations Security Council holding another meeting today about the war. The focus today: the people in Ukraine who were the victims of forced displacement. As the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, was heading in for the meeting, she stopped and spoke with reporters.
I'm late getting into the council, but just want to say that we called today's UN Security Council meeting along with Albania to discuss Russia's filtration operations, the process by which Russia filters out Ukrainians they deem threatening or resistant to Russian rule. And it's a real chilling word, the word filtration. What it boils down to is a series of horrors happening in real time in Europe that echoes a very dark period of the past. We have evidence that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, including children, have been interrogated, detained, and forcibly deported, and some of them sent to very remote areas. As you can see here, this graphic visualizes the process of filtration. The experience is different for everyone, depending on how threatening they are perceived to be toward Russia's invasion, and some are allowed to remain in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, some are forcibly deported to Russia, and some are sent to prison, and some simply vanish. A growing number of eyewitnesses and survivors of filtration operations tell stories of threats, of harassment, and incidents of torture by Russian security forces. They've had their biometric data captured, identification documents confiscated, and all means of communication cut off. They've been subject to invasive searches, interrogation under inhumane and demeaning circumstances. It really is horrifying. And so we're here today to shine a light on what's happening in these filtration centers and demand that Russia halt these operations, allow for independent observers to access these sites, and verify the well-being of the individuals that they have taken and put in these filtration centers. Thank you very much. I got to run.
U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas Greenfield at the UN Security Council in New York City outside the chamber as she was heading in for today's meeting. When she spoke at the meeting, she also suggested that Russia is displacing these Ukrainians, deporting them, to prepare for annexing more Ukrainian territory. Also speaking during the meeting, the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, he denied that Russia is doing any of this and pointed the finger back at the U.S.
As for the so-called filtration, first of all, we don't really understand what is being talked about here because the very term filtration doesn't have a clear definition in international humanitarian law. If we're talking about identifying among those people who want to come to Russia, Ukrainian citizens who are fighters of the nationalist battalions or Ukrainian army soldiers who participated in crimes against the civilian population, then that's normal practice for any army around the world. And when it comes to filtration activities, it's the Americans, colleagues, who could tell us better than anyone else who requested this meeting about filtration activities. Just look at the program started by the previous administration to expel to Mexico tens of thousands of forced displaced persons who requested asylum in the United States. The migrants were kept in inhumane conditions, deprived of their rights and legal representation, of their interests, and also just court proceedings. At the same time, the American authorities often separated families and sending children and their parents to different detention centers. More than 2,500 such cases were recorded. For many years, there was the illegal detention without trial or investigation of the prisoners in Guantanamo, perhaps the darkest stain on the very stained human rights reputation of the United States. Still, nobody has borne responsibility for the use of torture either, or mistreatment of the prisoners in secret CIA prisons, which in the 2000s were operating including in European countries.
Through an interpreter, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, at today's UN Security Council meeting in New York City. Also today in Ukraine, the chief state inspector for nuclear and radiation safety saying that Ukraine is considering shutting down that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. He said the continued deterioration of the situation, the prolonged lack of power supply from an external source of electricity will force us to deploy standby diesel generators, and it is extremely difficult to top up the diesel fuel supply during the war. The Russian military continues to occupy that nuclear power plant, and there has been shelling in the area. Russia and Ukraine trading the blame on which side is provoking what could lead to a catastrophic nuclear accident. The new British Prime Minister Liz Truss, in her second day leading the majority Conservative Party and now Prime Minister, facing off for the first time in the House of Commons in London with the Labour Party leader Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister has made reducing high energy prices one of her top priorities, and opposition leader Starmer asking what role extra taxes, windfall taxes, on energy company profits might take.
Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on her appointment? When she said in her leadership campaign that she was against windfall taxes, did she mean it?
Yeah. Very good. Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his welcome. I hope that we will be able to work together, particularly on areas we agree on, and I know that we have had strong support from the opposition in opposing Vladimir Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And I want us to continue to stand up to that appalling Russian aggression that has led to the energy crisis we face now. I am against a windfall tax. I believe it is the wrong thing to be putting companies off investing in the United Kingdom just when we need to be growing the economy.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for that answer. I ask because the Treasury estimates are that the energy producers will make £170 billion in excess profits over the next 2 years. The Prime Minister knows she's no choice but to back an energy price freeze. But it won't be cheap, and the real choice The political choice is who is going to pay. Is she really telling us that she's going to leave these vast excess profits on the table and make working people foot the bill for decades to come?
Well, I understand that people across our country are struggling with the cost of living and they're struggling with their energy bills. And that is why I, as Prime Minister, will take immediate action to help people with the cost of their energy bills. And I will be making an announcement to this House on that tomorrow and giving people certainty to make sure that they are able to get through this winter and be able to have the energy supplies and be able to afford it. But we can't just deal with today's problem. We can't just put a sticking plaster on it. What we need to do is increase our energy supplies long term. And that is why we will open up more supply in the North Sea, which the Honourable Gentleman has opposed. That is why we will build more nuclear power stations, which the Labour Party didn't do when they were in office. And that is why we will get on with delivering the supply as well as helping people through the winter.
With more on the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss's second day in office and her first time as leader at Prime Minister's Questions, we're joined from Great Britain by Peter Knowles, C-SPAN's Westminster producer. Thanks so much for being with us. How did the new Prime Minister do at PMQ?
I think she did pretty well. It is not an easy task. The questions come at you from all quarters and you don't know the questions before they're asked. It's a bit of an ordeal for all prime ministers. Not many of them really enjoy it, but and expectations were not that high. Liz Truss is not the best public speaker who's ever occupied that office, but she coped fine with the questions. It was a relatively gentle event as an inaugural event, though there wasn't too much hostility, and her own side were quite supportive, which you'd expect, but they were certainly nobody was behaving badly on day one. But yeah, she did fine, and she managed to give some quite tart responses when the questions were that little bit fiercer. The main disagreement with the leader of the opposition was over the question of windfall or one-off taxes for the energy giants, the big energy producing companies. And that's a political fault line that is opening up as to whether that's appropriate. So she disagreed with the leader of the opposition on that, and that's going to play out in the next day or two quite big.
This situation, you have one prime minister resigning, another from the same party now taking over. What kind of challenges does she face as she tries to forge her own path? At the same time, it's the same party, so it's the same agenda.
It's a really good question. This came up in the lobby briefing after Prime Minister's Questions, which is this dilemma that she has stood on a party manifesto, and manifesto commitments are meant to be kept and adhered to quite strictly. Then she's been part of the government that has had a speech delivering the programme for government, which we call the Queen's Speech, though it's actually the government's speech. And now there's this third iteration, which is what's she going to do, having made a whole bunch of campaign promises to her membership, some of which were at variance with the manifesto and at variance with the Queen's Speech. So how does that play out? It's really tricky. And interestingly, of course, she doesn't have that kind of overwhelming support that her predecessors have had from her own party. She never got a majority of her own MPs voting for her. She got less than a third of the votes in the last round of elections that belonged just to the MPs. And although she won a clear majority of her membership, it wasn't an overwhelming majority. It was a much smaller majority than her predecessors had achieved in that kind of vote. So she starts off at something of a disadvantage, notwithstanding, of course, all the really big economic and other issues that the UK faces.
The White House said that President Joe Biden called and spoke with the new prime minister. How does the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. change with a new leader?
Well, it depends what's really important. If what's most important is an alliance of values and a military alliance that is very committed to support for Ukraine against Vladimir Putin, then it's pretty rock solid. The UK has been in the forefront in Europe in supporting the Ukrainian government and continues to be so, and that's not in question. There is no wavering from that whatsoever. The problem that lies behind all that is this unfinished business from Brexit, from the departure from the EU, and the unresolved questions over how to manage the relationship with the EU, where it brings Northern Ireland into the picture. And that's a really difficult equation. Nobody seems to have quite figured out how to do this in a way that's peaceable and equitable. And this could cause some problems in that relationship. But as I say, if the fundamentals are around a military and values-based alliance in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine, then things are in pretty good shape.
We're talking with Peter Knowles, C-SPAN's Westminster producer in London. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave a pretty fiery farewell speech yesterday. What was that like, and what happens to him now?
Well, it was a very characteristic speech in that it was funny and cheerful and optimistic and had an interesting classical allusion. He, at the end of the speech, he said he would be like Cincinnatus. Now, he would have known very well that, as a classical scholar, that none of the rest of us are classical scholars and that we would all have to look that one up. Having looked up Cincinnatus, we discover that he was a Roman leader who retired to his farm. So all well and good so far with the analogy. But then he makes a political comeback and he takes over the Roman state on his comeback from his farm. So Boris Johnson was having some fun. He was teasing us all, and he was at least heavily hinting actually, that he wouldn't rule out making a comeback because he knows that he still enjoys a lot of popularity, and he's a more engaging and popular speaker than his successor is ever likely to be. She doesn't claim to be a great orator or great wit, so he's keeping himself in play to some degree.
Back to the new prime minister, some of the opposition already calling for a general election. When might that happen?
Well, yes, it's an interesting question. The Prime Minister is not required to call a general election until a full 5 years of the term is over and done with, and that's actually the very latest moment it could come would be in another 2 and a bit years, in January 25, though nobody would expect the parliamentary term to go on beyond late 24. But obviously new prime ministers get very tempted, as Theresa May was, to claim their mandate and to hold an election at a time of their choosing and to come back in a cloud of glory. But the example of Theresa May is not particularly encouraging. She started off with a really big poll lead and blew it and ended up with a miserable minority, losing her majority in an election that she was expected to win. Now, Liz Truss is arriving at a time when the Conservative Party is doing quite badly in the polls. It's quite hard, in fact, for any governing party to be doing well at the moment in the face of sky-high inflation and energy costs and anxieties over all these sort of different things. They're well behind Labour, the main opposition party, in the polls, and it would be fairly astonishing if the new Prime Minister were to decide that this was the moment to test their value in front of the public with a surprise snap election. Along with everybody else, I'd be very surprised if that was to happen.
Peter Knowles is C-SPAN's Westminster producer, joining us from London. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as Prime Minister Liz Truss chooses her top advisors, Reuters reports that she has selected a cabinet where for the first time a white man will not hold one of the country's 4 most important ministerial positions. The article adds that British governments have until a few decades ago been made up of mostly white men. It took until 2002 for Britain to appoint its first ethnic minority cabinet minister, when Paul Boateng was appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word, to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.